He has a blacklist that is on the wall of all its outlets, which has pictures of these guys and descriptions of them, and says, "Thou shalt not accept bets from these geezers." He made the elementary mistake of trying to sail a large amount of cocaine back to Australia on a yacht from South America. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Now, this week we've had a sad thing happen. The son of a man I know well, that I admired immensely as a boxer, an athlete, the son of Barry Michael, former world champion boxer. His name is Zach Swetnam, which is Barry Michael's correct surname. And Zach Swetnam, as we sit here making this podcast, is under arrest for the stabbing death of someone he knew, I think, outside of Footscray Hotel. Now, we won't go into any details about that. It's a tragic event. But it reminds us that some sports and some versions of crime are never that far from each other. And I think it's fair to say that the boxing ring, the martial arts ring, and various forms of horse racing and dog racing have always attracted their fair share of scallywags and scoundrels. In fact, I can recall the time when greyhounds raced at Olympic Park here in Melbourne on Monday nights, and it was always said, and there was truth in this, that you wouldn't get your house burgled in Melbourne on a Monday night because all the burglars were at the Olympic Park dogs. Now, I don't want to insult people who follow the greyhound racing because clearly they're not all burglars, but there was just a degree of truth in it. And I have to say that looking back over 40-odd years of crime reporting, perhaps more than 40 years, I've detected quite a lot of skullduggery around the margins. This goes a long way back. It goes all the way back to the bushranger days. Who, for instance, would know that Steve Hart, a member of the Kelly gang, one of Ned Kelly's right-hand men, died at the shootout at Glenrowan. Steve Hart rode many winners in the northeast of Victoria, including, I understand, the Benalla Handicap. He rode winners in professional horse races. He wasn't the only bushranger to ride winners. I believe that one of Ben Hall's offsiders, Johnny Dunn, was a little light-built guy that rode as a jockey around back districts. Then there was Mad Dan Morgan, notorious bushranger, rode in horse races in the 1800s. Squizzy Taylor, one of the most notorious criminals in Australian history, especially Melbourne history. They're still selling houses out there in the inner suburbs saying, "Did Squizzy hide out here?" You know, all that sort of stuff. He's part of Melbourne folklore. Squizzy Taylor rode 37 winners as a jockey on the inner suburban pony tracks. These were the unregistered racing tracks that were run by John Wren and other entrepreneurs around inner Melbourne, Richmond, Fitzroy, Ascot. A pretty big deal. A lot of money was bet there. Squizzy Taylor, of course, was crooked, and he was finally rubbed out in 1905 because he pulled up a horse called Ben Bolt in a fairly important race at the old Ascot track out near Flemington. And it was then that Squizzy Taylor, real name Joseph Leslie Theodore Taylor, it was then that he turned to other forms of crime than pulling up racehorses. He started to rob banks and shoot people and all sorts of bad things, which of course ended badly, as it usually does, because Squizzy Taylor was shot dead by another crook in a house in Carlton in 1927. They called him Squizzy. The next jockey who became a prominent crook was a bloke called Edward Smith, better known as Jockey Smith. Jockey Smith, born in Colac in 1942, left school at 13 or 14, became an apprentice jockey, I think at Geelong, or maybe Geelong, maybe Caulfield, maybe both. Gave it up at 18 because the bright lights of the underworld enticed him. He became a very prominent armed robber and jail escapee. He, in fact, was suspected of the murder of a bookmaker in Sydney called Lloyd Tidmarsh, who was shot dead in his own house in 1977. Probably Jockey Smith did it. Jockey Smith was on the run in the early 90s and he was shot dead at Creswick in central Victoria while he was hiding out up in that area. He did a foolish thing. He pulled a gun on a policeman and was ultimately shot. Funny thing about Jockey Smith is, even when he was a fugitive living on the lam out in the bush up in the south coast districts of New South Wales, he lived near Nowra for a while, and he trained horses there as a fugitive, as a escapee from jail, under the name of Tommy Cummings. This was very cheeky because, of course, he just spliced together the names of the two most prominent horse trainers in Australia of that era, Tommy Smith and Bart Cummings. That is how cheeky Jockey Smith was. But, as we say, it didn't end happily. But it's not just racing, of course. Boxing has always attracted its share of skullduggery. And this goes a long way back. And the more you look, the more you find. And, of course, listeners will remember their own villains who have graced the boxing ring. But a few come to mind. One is Dean Waters. There was a time when the Waters brothers, who were trained by their father, they were a pretty big deal back in the 1980s. And I think there were three brothers and they all boxed pretty well, all coached by their father, who had his own demons. Apparently the father persuaded his son Dean Waters, who was the Australian heavyweight champion at one time, to shoot a horsebreaker called Alan Hall. Now, I think this was a sort of a domestic thing, that Alan Hall had run away with the wife or partner of Mr. Waters, the boxing trainer, and the old man had killed Alan Hall. Dean Waters was tried in 1997, but cleared of murder and manslaughter by a jury due to diminished responsibility because of his abusive father. Very interesting case. The background is that Dean, along with his brothers Guy and Troy, grew up subjected to severe domestic violence orchestrated by their father, Cess Waters. The jury heard that Dean acted under the influence of his tyrannical father when the killing took place. The fact is that after a period of initial charges and being discharged at a committal hearing, Dean was so consumed with guilt that he ultimately turned himself in at Wyong Police Station in 1996, confessing to the crime entirely of his own volition. He couldn't live with himself. And the jury and the judge saw that that was the case. Not quite so conscience-stricken are the Nikolic brothers. There are three Nikolic brothers, and of course we're only talking about two of them. We're not talking about Tom Nikolic because, as far as I know, he's a clean skin. But there are two others. And one is John Nikolic, who is serving a long sentence in a Fiji prison because he made the elementary mistake of trying to sail a large amount of cocaine back to Australia on a yacht from South America. And when he called in at Fiji to dock his yacht and get food and all the rest of it, he thought if he just turned the lights off, he could just sail into the harbour without any fanfare. But of course, they knew he was there and they knew the boat had tried to sneak in. They searched the boat, they found a large amount of cocaine and a handgun, and they arrested John Nikolic, and he was sentenced to something like 23 years in prison, which has recently been knocked back to 18, I think. Now, John Nikolic is the older brother of Danny Nikolic. Danny Nikolic was a very good jockey back in the day, and when I say back in the day, I mean more than 20 years ago. He won a Caulfield Cup on Mummify, among other big races, was a very good big-time jockey at the top of his profession, but the dark side beckoned to Danny, and he got involved with some shady customers, and he ended up rubbed out from racing, as many people will recall, because he threatened the life of the Victorian chief steward of the day, one Terry Bailey. He did that at Seymour Races, and although he subsequently looked straight in the eyes of judges and stewards and all the rest of it and denied threatening Mr Bailey, the fact is other people heard him do it, including someone who's related to me. So there's no doubt that he did it. And in fact, I know that he admitted doing this because he told a prominent AFL footballer when they were both working out together at a gym in South Melbourne. He said, I shouldn't have threatened Terry Bailey's family. And that really was an admission he made outside the steward's room. But you can take it to the bank that it's true. Now, of course, Danny's got himself into trouble more recently. Not only he's been warned off from racing for many years, he's not supposed to set foot on the track, he's not supposed to bet, I think. He's certainly been very close to a fellow called Eddie Hasten, who is a big-time punter. He's a guy that runs brothels. He's got a lot of other bad habits. He's been accused of being a race fixer. And Eddie Hasten, along with Tony Mockbell and his brother Horty Mockbell and many others, are on the list of 100 punters that the TAB will not bet with. The TAB has a blacklist that is on the wall of all its outlets, which has pictures of these guys and descriptions of them and says, thou shalt not accept bets from these geezers. And the geezers include Eddie Hasten, very good friend of the Nikolic brothers. Oddly enough, Danny Nikolic is not on that list. I don't know why. But he's got plenty of other troubles at the minute. He's got himself into some very deep water. We can't name all the footballers that have got into trouble over the years because many of them are still alive. But one of the greatest players in Carlton Football Club history, he got into trouble over the years for theft and fraud and things. I suspect it's to do with gambling. Quite a lot of footballers have come adrift either late in their own careers or after they've given up the game. They've become gambling addicts, and this has played out pretty badly for some of them. Some of these stories are well known. Sometimes these guys have turned over a new leaf and talked about it. Others have not, and others have actually committed criminal acts in order to subsidise their gambling. So big-time Carlton player is one of them. He's not the only big-time Carlton player who has fallen afoul of the law. There's one terrific premiership player, a big occasion player, who ended up, if not a gambling addict, certainly a drug addict, and he stooped as low as to defraud his own club's supporters and his own teammates. And one of the things he did, this big-time player, this terrific finals player, very well known in his day, he cooperated with somebody who forged finals tickets, and they got these tickets and they sold them to trusting Carlton supporters who paid a large amount of money for them, only to find that when they got to the game that the people with the legitimate tickets were sitting in those seats. They duplicated legit tickets. This wasn't a good thing to do. It made people very, very sad. But this same guy, he's so shameless that when they have premiership reunion dinners, all the other players from the premierships that he played in know that you never let him pay the bill. Because what he'd do, and he did this once, he'd go around and collect cash from each of his fellow heroes in the Blues team. You know, he'd go around and collect cash from, the premiership coach and 20-odd others. And then he would put it in his pocket and either not pay at all or pay with a dud credit card or a stolen credit card or something and pocket the dough. And forever after that happened, his old teammates would say, no, we'll pay the bill and you just give us your cash to cover you. And that's what would happen because he'd really hit the skids. I think a combination of gambling and drugs, which will do it every time. He's in good company though, one of the greatest players to play for Collingwood and possibly Essendon. Was in the same boat. Magnificent player, tough, inspiring, much admired. His name was Des Tuddy, one of the greatest players of the era when I was going to school. In December 1980, Des Tuddenham was found guilty by a county court jury of having received stolen tyres valued at $30,000. He was remanded in custody. $30,000 in 1980 was about 3 times what I earned in a year that year. So it was a reasonably significant figure. It was a time when you could buy a small house in the inner suburbs for $30,000, and that's how much Des Tuddenham was charged with in the form of stolen tyres. In 1989, he pleaded guilty to a charge of conspiring to defraud the Victorian Automobile Chamber of Commerce of $13,000. He told the magistrate that he was guilty on the grounds I was helping out a friend in trouble, which is possibly right. He was probably always a generous fella, as well as a tough one. And there were a few other bits and pieces. I think he got done a couple of times for drink driving, but we won't bother talking about that here. Talking of former champions, there's a former Carlton and Richmond champion. A very tricky character. Tough, uncompromising, a little bit scary. I think he was a goal kicker and that rival players were fairly nervous of him. He was a punter, still is, big punter, ladies' man, let's say. Nice way to put it, ladies' man. He got a bit short of money back in the 1980s because he was a regular and reckless punter. And at one point in that era, a large man wearing a mask and carrying a handgun walked into an Ascot Vale premises which was being used for the purposes of SP bookmaking. And he ordered the people in there to lie on the floor and put their heads down. And they did that immediately, and they tried not to peek at him because they knew exactly who it was. Not only they knew his voice and the way he looked, but his mask had slipped a little bit as well. But they put their hands around their eyes and pretended not to recognise him because they thought that might be embarrassing, and they knew that they'd be seeing him at the races the following Saturday and they didn't want to be embarrassed. And the SP bookie concerned, I think it was Alan Tripp, who's since become a multi-millionaire and a very interesting man and a very admirable person in many ways. But he took the long view, because he was a wise man, he took the long view that let's not worry too much because we know we'll be winning it back from him at the races in due course, which I think is what happened. So that well-known footballer ended up being an armed robber, and he will die broke, but he's still out there, He once told me how he pulled a ring in with a trotter at the trots at Shepparton, and the amazing thing about that story was he said that he had a steward on side, a steward so much on side that the name of the horse that was in the race book was, let's say King Rabbit. I'm making that name up, obviously. And King Rabbit, the real King Rabbit, was a large bay horse, but the horse that he rung in was a small black horse. Work that out. Clearly the stewards just were not trying in that race at Shepparton, at the trots on that particular night, because our friend, the former Carlton player, had the job sewn up. I won't help him later on. There are some more sinister figures. We've talked about some of them in Life and Crimes before. There is a kickboxer out there, a former kickboxing champion, a man with a memorable ring name. That's a memorable ring name. And it tells you that he's very tough. And that man is suspected by very, very well-informed police and others of not only shooting his own young wife, I think a 23-year-old woman who had a 2-year-old child, but shooting another young wife, the mother of a young child, for money. He did it as a paid hit. And also at least 2 other murders. One of the most cold-blooded killers going around in Australia. He's still out there. He lives in Melbourne. He is a very quiet character. When I say he lives in Melbourne, he currently might be living in what we call the Grey Bar Motel. He might be locked up at present, but not over a murder. That man was a very successful kickboxer in his day, and many of the people he knocks around with are very successful or were very successful boxers and or martial artists. And they also dabbled in acting and in armed robbery. It's one of those things, they all go together. Which introduces us to the name of Ange Goussis. Now, Ange Goussis is in jail. He was a very good young boxer in his day, good suburban boy, boxed really well, had a big chance of going to the Olympics. He trained for it, but his dream was derailed. I'm not sure if he got injured or what happened, but he fell into bad company. And he ended up, as a few boxers do, he ended up running around with crooks, gangsters, as some sort of heavy bodyguard character. And he drifted from being a bodyguard into being a gunman, an armed bodyguard. And he ran around with a man that we can't name, even though he's now dead. A man that we have on this podcast called Snake Eyes, because he's had so many aliases that our lawyers keep changing them. So we will call him Snake Eyes. Ange Goussis did dirty work for Snake Eyes and in fact ended up carrying the can for Snake Eyes. And he fell very hard. He is one of the saddest stories of falling from grace. But I think there's a sadder one. One of the greatest stories in Australian sport is the story of a brilliant Aboriginal kid called Lionel Rose, one of the best natural athletes, one of the best natural boxers anywhere in the world in his era and possibly any era. He was so fast, he was so gifted, he was so good at it. And as most people will still remember, Lionel Rose did an astonishing thing. He went to Tokyo at the age of 19, where he had lucked into a fight with the then world champion in his division. So there's Lionel, 19 years old. He's thrown into this fight with the much older, more seasoned, veteran, world-class fighter fighting Arata, who held the championship belt. He was 10-1 against. The bookmakers had young Rose, the teenager, at 10-1 against the hot favourite, Arata. But he outboxed Arata in his home city. He beat the Japanese fighter, the great hero of Japan at that time, in Japan, which takes some doing. And he came home to a welcome that was extraordinary. It was as big as when the Beatles had hit Melbourne a couple of years earlier, or say 4 years earlier. It was a stupendous thing. They say that 250,000 people lined the streets to see Lionel Rose be brought back to Melbourne. They were waiting out at Essendon Airport, which was then the airport used by Melbourne. They were on the tarmac, cheering, waving. They had police there holding them back. It was a total rock star welcome, the like of which has hardly been seen in Australia. Only the occasional one. The Beatles is the other big example. He went on to be a national figure, of course. He, sang songs very badly, written by other people, and they went on to the top 40 and so on. He was on the talk shows. He was everywhere. He got on the booze and on the cigarettes, and he made comebacks, and he lost his title and so on. But the fall of Lionel Rose wasn't just the fall of an athlete who got lucky and then got unlucky. Lionel Rose had a few bad habits and he ended up living around St Kilda working as basically a bouncer doorman type in a brothel down there. And he was running around with the criminal underclass. There's no doubt about that. And he got into all sorts of trouble. Had he not had such good connections and such a famous name, and had there not been so much goodwill for him, officially at every level, from the public right through to the Premier's office, he probably would have ended up doing a fair bit of jail time. But I was saddened to know that it was worse than that. And this might shock some people, but I found out after Lionel Rose's death that, in fact, a policewoman told me that she was working on an investigation of Lionel Rose which would indicate that he had been a systematic abuser of young girls in his sort of family and social circles around Druin, and that had he not died when he did, he probably would have been charged with historic sex offences, as we have seen other famous people do, i.e. Rolf Harris, Barry Cable and several others. Of all the stories we've told today, I think Lionel Rose's is the most tragic, the most pathetic and the most sordid. Sorry to be such a downer. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.